Theresa May, the then Prime Minister of the UK, officially informs the European Union that they are leaving. So that triggers what is referred to as Article 15 from the Treaty of the European Union, which means that there is a 2-year period to negotiate the conditions under which the country can leave, which means by 29th of March 2019, latest, the UK should leave the European Union officially. And then a few months later, June 2017, both sides have set up their negotiating team and the conditions can be discussed. 1 year later, 1.5 years later, November 2018, they reached some kind of an agreement, withdrawal agreement, which is supported by the entire European Union, except for the UK. It gets rejected actually in the Parliament in the UK House of Commons, which again leads to a lot of political commotion in the UK. In April 2019, an extension of the negotiation period is granted, this time until 31st of October 2019. So that gives 7 months extra to find a new agreement. And then July 2019, again, political change in the UK. Boris Johnson takes over from Theresa May and is the leader in the negotiations for the Brexit. And then we come to a speed up, I think, of events. 17th of October 2019, the UK and the European Union agree on a new withdrawal agreement. Some tweaking left and right allows for the House of Commons to approve that withdrawal agreement on the 22nd of October, but still needs to specify some aspects. So a little bit more extension is required again, which is given until the 31st of January, eventually in end of October 2019. And as we all know, 24th of January, just 1 week before the ultimate deadline, the withdrawal agreement is formally signed, both by the UK and all European Union people in charge. So that's where we stand today. We know that the UK is no longer a member of the European Union, but we are again in some kind of transition period. And I think this is where I hand over to Ben Richards to tell us what is happening now. Are the negotiations continuing, or what's the situation with the UK governments? Ben, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Bruno, and hopefully, colleagues, you can hear me. Good morning from the UK. I'm going to try and give you a relatively brief overview of really sort of what the situation is today since the end of the information that Bruno just gave you in terms of that the UK formally left on the 31st of January. I think the very short explanation is that we're still in a very big mess with Brexit. And I think that's probably still the summary that you've heard from us and colleagues from across the UK for the last nearly 4 years now since the referendum in 2016. As Bruno said, we formally left the European Union on the 31st of January this year, and we're now in what's called the transition period. And this transition is due to last until the 31st of December this year. And in this period is when actually the majority of the very complicated work that needs to be done to facilitate the UK's exit from the European Union needs to be done, and the framework put in place for our future relationship. The withdrawal agreement that Bruno spoke about that was signed and agreed towards the end of last year really only dealt with a couple of key issues around how much money the UK owed to the European Union, rights of citizens, both EU citizens in the UK and UK citizens in the rest of the European Union member states, and also trying to put in place some sort of mechanism to deal with obviously the very difficult situation of the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, which will become an external border of the European Union for the first time, obviously, since our accession to the EU back in the early 70s. So you can see just how much is left to work out about what our future relationship between the UK and the EU will be. And very intense negotiations were to be needed even before the COVID-19 crisis hit us. And I think certainly from the trade union movement point of view in the UK and across the rest of Europe, we were extremely skeptical that you could conclude such complicated negotiations within a period of basically 6 months, if you also take into account what would be needed in terms of the European Parliament, the European Council, and the UK Parliament formally ratifying any deal if we got to that point. I mean, if you look at, even a trade agreement between the EU and Canada took several years on a much more simple basis than it is in unpicking 40 years of integration of the UK into the EU system. So, beginning in February, the European Union really took the lead in setting out their mandate for the negotiations. And although I think we're right to maintain a number of our criticisms to the way in which the EU engages in trade negotiations, relative to the UK, the EU side has been very transparent in both their mandate and indeed the publication of a draft text for a future trade agreement with the UK. So we have a relatively good idea about what it is that the EU is looking for in terms of its future relationship with the UK, based on, as far as possible, frictionless trade, zero tariffs, but also a strong obligation on the UK that they maintain what is called a level playing field. In effect, that the UK promises to continue to play by the rules of the game after Brexit to allow it access to the European market. And that covers obviously areas of great importance for us in the trade union movement of things like labour and social rights, but as well as other things such as regulation, environmental regulation, consumer issues, and elsewhere. Unfortunately, it's still pretty unclear what the UK government actually wants out of the negotiation process. I think, unfortunately, what is clear is that they're looking for a much looser type of future relationship between the UK and the European Union, something much more in line with the CETA Canada Free Trade Agreement. And that, I think, causes us a number of problems from a trade union movement point of view, irrespective of the economic impact that such a weak link would have. There are a number of important implications that would enable the UK potentially to diverge quite significantly on issues of social policy, labour policy, environmental policy from the European Union, which obviously would damage our members in the UK, but also would be extremely dangerous for working people across the rest of the European Union. You've only got to imagine the struggles that we've gone through to try and get the EU to take a slightly more positive approach towards social policy in the last few years. If the UK is on the edge of Europe, pursuing a low wage, low regulation, low tax policy, how much more difficult that will be for then the remaining EU 27 to make positive progress on social rights, employment rights, etc. So the face-to-face negotiations were due to begin at the beginning of March. There are 11 parallel sets of negotiations that are running, one of them on the level playing field, but others around things like trade in goods, trade in services, fisheries policy, and all the other aspects that need to be dealt with. And like I say, there were due to be negotiation meetings approximately every 3 weeks, and then COVID-19 came along. And as you said in your introduction, Bruno, this is affecting everybody in Europe, everywhere across the world. And I think an indication of that was that both the EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, and the UK's chief negotiator, David Frost, both contracted COVID-19 in the very early stages of March. Now, obviously, face-to-face negotiations were stopped, and they've been looking to the possibility of continuing negotiations just as we are today via video link systems. And after a 6-week break, they held the first such set of negotiations last week. And I think as we're all learning through this process, these systems are really good and they allow us to continue to communicate and discuss, but they are no substitute for face-to-face meetings. And I think that's obviously linked to where we need to come out with at the end with European Works Councils, but it also then makes the negotiation process between the EU and the UK much more difficult. And the reports at the end of that first meeting last week were not very encouraging, to be frank. Michel Barnier was quite scathing about what he saw as the attitude of the UK negotiating team, in that they seem to be unprepared to engage concretely on some of the difficult issues, and you can see there was a lot of frustration. And that is putting a lot of pressure on, because although the transition period ends on the 31st of December, any decision to extend that transition period must be taken by the 30th of June at the latest. And only 2 more rounds of negotiation are planned between now and that deadline. So it really puts on the table the fear that we've all had since the start of this process, that it's a very real scenario that the UK could leave the EU with no deal, because the European Union Commission, the EU Commission, will assess during June how far and what progress they feel has been made in the negotiations. If they feel there is sufficient progress to continue and there's a possible constructive way out of this, then the negotiations will continue. If they feel that actually, the UK has no intention of reaching a positive deal, then the EU, even the EU side, will switch its resources to preparing for no deal. And obviously, both outcomes have serious implications for our work in European Works Councils and elsewhere. But as we've always said, no deal is the worst possible outcome. So although I think everyone understands that there really does need to be an extension to the transition period, particularly given the COVID-19 crisis, unfortunately, the UK government position seems to be hardening at the moment. And therefore, there's a certain degree of brinkmanship going on when you think we're 1st of May Day tomorrow. We really got a month before decisions will have to be taken on extending the transition or where we go. So that's, I think, a very sort of short update, Bruno, of the situation today. I'm happy to take questions from colleagues before we get into the meat of the recommendations on European Works Councils. But I think in terms of an introduction, the final thing I'd say is that probably the irony of the situation is that with Brexit, let alone COVID-19, we need the rights that European Works Councils give us to information and consultation, and obviously participation within European companies, probably more than ever, in terms of ensuring that the voices of the workers and our members are heard within these multinational companies. So I think certainly from the UK, we're really pleased with the recommendations that the European Trade Union Federations have been putting together, and the work that yourself and the colleagues across the federations are doing to try and maintain as far as possible active, well-working European Works Councils as we go through this process.
Thank you, Ben. Maybe can you say a few words also before we go to the recommendations themselves, from a point of view from the UK members in the EWC and from your side, from the unions in the UK, how do you live this? What do people expect really? Do they already suffer measures such as being expelled from EWCs? What's happening? What is your take on that?
I think we've had so far very limited examples of multinational companies seeking to exclude UK representation at the moment. I think, there have been 1 or 2 at most examples of that, and we've been able to push back strongly and very quickly against that, because we may be 4 years after the referendum, but in legal terms, as of today, nothing's changed in terms of the legal rights and responsibilities for UK representation on European Works Councils. And I think the majority of multinational companies have understood that and actually have taken fairly sensible decisions not to try and, if you like, take us on at this stage. I think obviously our concern is what happens after Brexit is finally concluded, when we get into the next stage, formally having ended the transition period. And in that sense, it's a mixed picture. We have a growing number of multinational companies where we've already been able to negotiate the continued representation of UK EWC members moving into the future. There are probably a larger number who are ducking the question at the moment. And there's a handful who have made it fairly clear that if they can, they'd like to exclude the UK in the future. So in terms of, our work in Unite and other UNI Europa affiliates in the UK with EWC members, it's using these ETUI recommendations are really the same message that we've been giving our EWC reps in the UK. Seek to engage with your company at the earliest opportunity. there are opportunities to maintain UK representation, but also this is about maintaining the rights for EWC reps and a good set, not just for the UK, but for across Europe as well, because again, cutting the UK out of European Works Councils will obviously also then damage the information and consultation that is available for the remaining EWC reps from the EU 27.
Okay, I think that takes us nicely into the recommendations indeed, and I think I saw already appearing in the chat box somewhere also people asking, but what does it really mean for the European Works Councils? And just to try and somehow make it clear, I've got this table for you. I think there are 4 categories that we can distinguish of impact on a European Works Council from the UK leaving the European Union and therefore not falling under the application of the EWC directive anymore. The red box, the top box, is obviously the ones that are really mostly at risk. Those are EWCs that have their headquarters either in the UK or elsewhere. It doesn't really matter, but the fact is that as soon as the UK employees are not considered as in the calculation of the number of employees, so you don't meet the threshold anymore of having 1,000 employees in the whole of European Union, European Economic Area, and not 2 countries with at least 150 employees. Could be just France and the UK where you had 150 or more employees. If that's no longer the case, actually that company, that group, does not have to have a European Works Council anymore. So management could take the initiative of abolishing, cancelling the entire body. You can continue, but if you do, and I think that's also part of the recommendations that I recently saw from the European Commission, if you continue with your agreement, it would be purely on a voluntary basis. So you're no longer covered by the legal framework of the European Union. So that's a high risk there. Some EWCs might simply disappear entirely. The second level is those European Works Councils that have the reference law in the UK headquarters. And well, in that case, no problem with the thresholds. Even if the UK would leave, would not be counted in the number of employees anymore. You would still have enough people for having a European Works Council. Then the question is, what will be the new reference law? Because you can't refer to the UK legislation anymore, the so-called TISA legislation. And you obviously also have the problem that UK reps might be forced to leave the European Works Council. So there, 2 actions need to be taken. You need to find new reference law, agree on the new headquarters reference for the European Works Council, and try to keep the UK colleagues on board. Third, again, weaker impacts, if you like, is on those EWCs that have their headquarters not in the UK, in any of the other countries of the European Union, European Economic Area. No problem with the thresholds. They're the only risk, still an important risk, but the only risk is that the colleagues from the United Kingdom might again be requested to leave the European Works Council because they are no longer under the scope of application. So there, the action to be taken is to make sure that the UK colleagues stay on board, and you have to renegotiate the agreement to make sure the UK is still covered in the scope of that EWC. And then there's a 4th category, the box in green. You might say no impact because the headquarters are not in the UK. You don't even have any UK representatives, no branches in the UK. So everything fine? Well, still there, I think there is still the risk that in the future, if your company would extend and develop activities in the UK, obviously, you will not be able to include any representatives from the UK at that point. So probably there already, you should look into your agreement to try and get some rule in there that in the future, the UK will also be covered still by your EWC agreement, and maybe new members might join at some later point in time. So I think question of impact on EWC, those are the 4 categories you have to bear in mind. To help you through that, the European Trade Union Federations understand that it's important to give you clear guidelines, obviously well in coordination with the UK trade unions also, who are very eager to stay involved, as we heard from Ben, in those European Works Councils, not only because at the UK level themselves, they don't really have very high, strong standards of information consultation. So the EWC is a very important level for them. that's why you have these recommendations, so to help you through this process. And I think I can give the floor from here on to Annika to take us to these through these recommendations, which are actually an update of, I think it was in 2018 when we had a first set, when the decision was taken for the UK to leave the EU. There was a first set of recommendations, and now you have a fresh, updated set. So Annika, I give the floor to you from here.
Okay, thank you, Bruno. Yeah, you're right, the updated recommendations. I will also later on ask Ben to intervene, because I think you're the better one to explain, because I knew there's the new amendment on the UK law and also the mismatch with the EU Commission's opinion on how it will see, how the future will be. So I will ask you on to intervene on that a little bit later. What I just would start with is to mention that during this transition period, there's nothing has changed, at least until 31st of December this year. It's also depending on if there will be an extension or not. So during the transition period, the UK law still applies. Oh no, the other way around. The European law still applies in UK. So the situation for EWCs, based on UK law and the UK members in these bodies, the situation for them are unchanged. So they still have the same rights and the duties. And I think Bruno also already mentioned that we have to be aware of that the companies might try to exclude already now or question the representatives from UK. And if so happens, please make it clear that there's nothing has changed so far. And also, of course, if needed, please contact your respective European trade union federations. So, and I will just mention one thing more before you change, because the last bullet point on the UK-based companies still applied. And of course, if they fill up the requirements, they are still obliged to launch the SMB when requested. And I just have to ask Ben, what will happen if during this transition period, for instance, a new SMB were a question. After the transition period, what will be the situation, let's say, if they start a negotiation now, and what will happen after 31st of December?
Well, I think some of that would depend on whether the transition period was extended or not, and some of it would depend on, if it's not, what the final status of any deal between the EU and the UK is in terms of our future relationship. But in the most basic terms, if on the 31st of December, transition comes to an end, say it's no deal, we're outside the scope then of the EU directive, that would mean that even if UK reps had been part of the special negotiating body up until that point, their legal right to continue to participate in that process would come to an end. However, just as it is with the participation in a full European Works Council, there is nothing that legally stops UK reps participating. That just has to then become an industrial relations negotiation issue between the employee side and the management of the company side. So I think, you know, when you're looking at SMBs or full European Works Council, the principles of trying to ensure that UK reps continue to participate, and indeed, as Bruno said on his previous slide, if we look into the future, when perhaps new European Works Councils will be set up, the UK and UK workers will still be part of the European market. And I think we will continue to do all we can to make sure that wherever possible, whatever the legal status is, that there is UK representation on those bodies.
Okay, thank you. Then we'll move forward to recommendation number 2. That if you have UK representatives in your EWC, we recommend you to take an active role in securing their rights for the UK reps. As everything is as Ben already mentioned, it's quite unsure. We don't know what will happen. It's very important to do whatever you can to secure their rights for the UK reps in the future. So and as the situation in the different companies could differ, it's also important to have a flexible and a case-by-case approach in this. And another recommendation is to review your agreement and see, is there any needs or adaptation? Some of the agreements already include representatives from countries outside the EEA. So, but if not, you might or you should need to do an adaptation. So, and then you need to define the scope of the change. So, and there are some examples in the slides. I would also like to mention that in the recommendations, there are some proposals of a clause that you can use as help for these adaptations. There are also examples of argument for you to bring forward during the negotiations or renegotiation or the adaptations discussions with your management. So I don't know if, Ben, would you like to add something?
No, I think that draft clause is there. I think the only interesting maybe thing to point out is that we should probably remember our history as well, because when the EWC directive first came into force, it didn't apply to the UK at that point either. And a number of multinational companies back in the late 1990s did include UK representatives on their European Works Councils then, prior to it becoming legally enforceable in 1999 in the UK. So, you know, there is precedent for both UK representation, but also representation from other countries outside of the European Union on European Works Councils. I think it's one of the strengths of the directive is that it obliges representation from within the European Union, but it certainly does not stop representation from outside, which is why I think, you know, we're in a strong position to continue to push for that.
There's a question from Albert. Bruno.
Yeah, I suggest that we take it at the end. We go through the 5 recommendations first, and we take the questions then. I saw the question from Albert. Thank you. Annika?
Okay. So then we continue. So here's where I was referring to Ben earlier, because as there are new amendments to the UK law, and there's also another quite different opinion from the EU Commission on what the direction in the future in case of a no deal Brexit. So Ben, would it be okay for you to just give us the background on this? Because to be honest, it's quite messy, and also as you see at the last bullet point, that will be maybe possible to that the UK, if we as a new deal, then we have to operate 2 EWC, one based on UK law and the other based on EU law, and that's quite hard to get a grip of. So
yeah, I'm not sure whether to say thank you, Annika, because it's always one of those things where you hand the complicated bit over to someone else to try and explain. And I think for the colleagues participating, obviously, what we're telling you today is our best understanding today. Certainly, we're not formal lawyers. I'm certainly not, and I know Bruno and Annika are not, but these are our best understandings of the current situation. So in terms of this recommendation, to take it maybe the simple part of it first, obviously, one of the issues that all European Works Councils will have to look at is that if your agreement is currently based on UK law, at the end of the transition period, if nothing is written within the future arrangement with the EU that governs it, and the UK is cut out completely, then you will need to look, and the company will need to find another member state in which that agreement will have to legally reside. Now, we know that many multinational companies may use this as an opportunity to almost shop around the different legal regimes in Europe, looking for that which is probably the weakest and puts the least amount of responsibility on them. And in many cases, multinationals are looking at the Republic of Ireland for that, because although the UK legislation was very weak, unfortunately, the Irish legislation was in many ways even weaker than that. So the recommendation from the European federations was very much that if this is a situation that's going to affect your company and your agreement, you should try and ensure as best as possible that whilst this is a management prerogative that they get to do, that their choice should be driven by objective criteria wherever possible, not just a simple move to a low standard country. So for example, looking at once the UK is no longer part of the European Works Council, which other member state has the highest number of employees within it, and looking at that as the potential legal seat for the European Works Council. And I think really it's a case of being proactive in that from EWC representatives' point of view, asking management for a discussion, trying to engage with them on the issue, and not just allowing them to shift the legal seat of the European Works Council without having had that engagement with yourselves as EWC reps. The final point that Annika put is very confusing, and I'm not sure even we in the UK really understand what's happening at the moment. It goes back to the fact that the UK government have said that on day one after Brexit formally happened, so the end of transition, all the current EU laws will be transposed into UK law and become active on day one. And they've said that that includes the European Works Council Directive. Now, we're not quite sure how you can do that as a country outside the European Union, and it's very unclear about what obligations that would put on other EU member states. The European Union and their advice is very clear that once transition ends, the UK is no longer covered by the EWC directive and therefore no longer has to be part of it. One of the interpretations of the advice that the UK government is giving that you can take is that, particularly in the case of the no-deal Brexit, if they've transposed directly across the EWC law and that is now a UK law, you could be in the very strange situation where a multinational company, if it's headquartered or based in the UK, under UK law will be obligated to operate a European Works Council, but could still be obligated under European law to also operate a European Works Council. Like I say, we don't really know why the UK government is putting it in this terms, but if you read probably the better worded explanation that you'll find within the actual documentation and the recommendations, this potentially does give some leverage in terms of the negotiation on the future status of European Works Council, because if this situation really does occur, then it would be very complicated for companies to operate. And I think that gives us a better opportunity to negotiate with companies to say, we want to work with you and create a more realistic, simple solution, but on the basis that the UK is still part of that European Works Council and UK reps are still on there. So as I said, this is something that's come out in the last couple of months. I think, if COVID-19 hadn't happened, certainly my colleague Jonathan Hayward was going to have a lot of meetings with UK government officials over the last couple of months to get to the bottom of this. Obviously, those meetings haven't taken place. So our understanding at the moment is that this could be a possibility in the case of no deal Brexit. But I think for the vast majority of people, it's those first three bullet points that you really need to be focusing on. The last one is a legal possibility, but it's maybe something not to be overly concerned with at this stage. But what's really key is to engage with your management early, be proactive, and try and ensure that if the legal seat of the European Works Council is moving, it's done on an objective basis and not just shifted to a low standard country.
Thank you, Ben. I'm happy that I wasn't the one that was supposed to explain that, because it's, as you said, it's quite confusing. Then we have the recommendation number 4. It says that it's recommended you to put the Brexit on your EWC's agenda, and that's for you to be able to anticipate the change in the company strategies and the businesses. So it's also important for you to ask for early and recurring information and consultation on the forecast and impact to the topic listed on the slide. So it's for the financial and economic situation, the trade and import cost on raw materials, employment, especially in UK, and the transfers of production, outbacks, closures, or relocation of the headquarters. So then we have recommendation number 5, and I think Bruno have covered it in the beginning. You have to be prepared to look into the consequences of UK leaving EU in your EWC, to look at the number of your employees per country. It's important to know what will happen if UK had account no longer should be taken into account. Is there a risk for you to falling below the minimum threshold? And if so, as it says, contact your respective European Trade Union Federation.
Thank you. That's the 5 recommendations as they stand today. We're still, unfortunately, a lot of uncertainty, which is not really new, which is what we have experienced in the past 3 years or so. Hopefully, if things go really bad at the end of the year, we'll have a no-deal Brexit, but at least the situation will be clear then in some way. Hopefully there will be a good agreement. Hopefully most EWCs can negotiate a solution for keeping the UK colleagues on board, as we also try to have Swiss representatives on board, for instance. That would be the optimal situation. But reality, unfortunately, is quite diverse. And maybe we can take a few practical experiences. But before we go into other questions, remarks, there was one that was already popping up in the chat box, I believe, which is, I think, quite easy to respond to. A question from Albert from what's the name of the company again? Escapes my the Telenet company, telecommunications company with an EWC based on Liberty Global, with an EWC based on Dutch law, but real headquarters in the UK. Actually, the question was, under what condition do we fall? Well, you're in the 3rd box in that case, I would say. There's no difficulty with the reference law. If it's already stated that the reference is the Dutch law, so you stay on the Dutch law. No discussion there, but you will have to try and make sure that the UK colleagues stay on board. So check your agreement whether in the scope it is already extended outside European Union, European Economic Area. If not, you'll have to introduce a clause or have an annex to your agreement stating that whatever happens, whatever the outcome of the negotiations, the UK colleagues will be covered by the agreement and will still have their representatives in the European Works Council. Cyprian, did you pick up other questions in the chat box?
Yes, you have 2 more questions. One from Daniel Fernandez Gonzalez, if I pronounce it correctly. It's a detailed question, but mainly about can a UK-based company change the agent and hence the reference legal basis? I'm reading it. It's the question: can they change it now before the Brexit? But it's even possible to change the law. And second question from Daniela: can you just recommend the good reference law? I mean, good for the AWC. Is it the German law, French law, Belgian law? In case of looking for a good legal system.
Ben or Annika, do you want to pick up on any of these questions?
I mean, I think this is one of those situations. I think, Bruno, you probably are just as expert, if not more, than myself or Annika on this, but I certainly can. I think on the first question, it may depend whether, for example, it's a US company that's currently using the UK as its legal seat. And obviously, there are already mechanisms in place by which companies who are headquartered outside of the European Union, the legal basis of those European Works Councils is determined. and there's probably more ability for them to move it before Brexit actually happens. If it is a UK owned and headquartered company, then certainly I would think, until, on the basis of, we said at the start, whilst transposition is going on, nothing changes legally. And I think we would want to make sure that it stayed under UK law until it was absolutely necessary for it to move somewhere else. So in terms of that first one, on the second one, I think on all of these issues as well, I wouldn't want to say, pick one country above the other at the moment. I say you do a lot of this, Bruno, you might have some thoughts on that. But I just recommend that colleagues, where these issues are coming up, make sure you're in touch with your European Trade Union Federation. Each of the federations has a contact person. So, for example, Annika for UNI Europa, but also I know a number of colleagues are part of other federations like Industrial Europe or ETF. Make sure that you're feeding information about your European Works Councils into those people, because we need to know what's happening in different companies, and we can only do that if you pass the information on. So I think that's also, this webinar is an excellent first bit in terms of trying to get, information across, but we need that information coming back from European Works Council reps as well about what's actually happening within their companies.
Yeah, in terms of what is a good reference law, I think first thing to remind you is that actually whatever the reference law is, you still have to negotiate an agreement. So what really matters is to have a good, strong agreement. Doesn't matter in which country it is located. And the difference between the countries is really not that big. Most countries have simply done some copy pasting. It's more with regard to, well, when it comes to really going to court, sanctions, etc., there you have huge differences. But let's hope that you never get to that point. But if so, it's obviously easier to follow court proceedings when your EWC is based on French law, German law, Belgian law, where you also have, that's the direct relation you have, where you also have strong local labor laws, and that's reflected in the way how the EWC is handled. So yeah, there's not one that I would say is the top reference law. They all have their own features. If you are based on Swedish law, you're entitled to at least 2 meetings per year instead of 1. If you're based on French law, you have a number of credit hours, which is guaranteed as an EWC member. They all have different small features, but it's minor differences. And again, in the end, you have to negotiate a good agreement. So that's the main thing, I think. Cyprian, any other questions?
Yes, there's a question from Roma to Annika and Ben, or whoever would like to reply. How do you feel about the possibility of UK members ending up with the observer status?
I mean, our first response is that, we want UK members to retain all the rights that they currently have. And I think that's not just for the UK reps and what it means to workers in the UK, but also what it means to workers across the rest of Europe as well. Because if the UK is a significant part of the business of your company, you also need to hear about what's happening in the UK. What are the trends? How does that affect decisions that are taken in the UK? How is that affecting you in the rest of Europe? So I think, when we're engaging with this, our first point of call is certainly much more than observer status. We know that the legal status is going to get complicated and we're not sure where it will be, but we want to maintain as far as possible the same rights that for a UK representative as for any other representative on that European Works Council after Brexit. One of the things just that we've been thinking of is that, and it's all, in 1 or 2 of those companies I mentioned that have already said we're going to exclude the UK, we've been looking at other elements within the EWC agreement to maintain a UK presence. So, for example, using the expert clause, because the expert clause doesn't define that you have to be from an EU member state to be an expert. So we've also suggested and thought there may be opportunities in the future if a company simply refuses to have anyone from the UK near it, it may be a case of nominating a UK person as the expert to that European Works Council, if it's appropriate for obviously the colleagues in the rest of Europe to do so, to ensure there's still a UK presence. Just looking for other points of leverage within the EWC agreements that we can potentially use to maintain a UK presence. But I think, obviously, you know, as you said at the start, our first aim is to maintain wherever possible full UK representation.
Mm-hmm. We are getting close to 11 o'clock, so maybe just one last question. Or Annika, I think you also wanted to have some practical experience from somebody from an EWC.
Yes, I don't know. I think that Brian and also Stefan from Teleperformance, EWC, are on the call.
Are you there?
We are.
Yeah, and I know that you have struggled for a long time to get your Brexit clause in your agreement. I was just curious to hear if there had been any progress.
Not really. Currently, the company is not really want to change the agreement. For us, the positive thing is because of COVID-19, we have now a different situation, and we have a lot of more talks with the company. And I think, at least in my eyes, maybe Brian can step in as well. We now have a new relationship with the company, and we are still positive that we can make changes. We show the value of the ECWC, and especially we show that we need the UK in. So in my eyes, there will be progress. It is complicated.
Mm-hmm.
We are a French-based company, and a French-based company is always a little bit interesting in deal with, at least out of a German perspective. Brian, maybe you want to
Yeah. Yes. Give me 2 seconds. I think the company has adopted a sort of wait and see what happens next approach. Ultimately, we have spoken to them several times to try and get the situation on the agenda, and to get them to move to either make an amendment in the current agreement, or to give a commitment that we will move towards the Norwegian sort of solution. As I understand it, Norway is not a full EU member, but they are an EEA member. So they're sort of saying it really depends on the outcome of the negotiations,
Mm-hmm.
whether it is if we come out of the EU and the EEA element, then it's a different question. Then they have the full question on the table. Our contact within the company has said he's minded to keep the UK in the ECWC as long as it is legally acceptable. But I think ultimately he's just trying to play a wait and see, or the company's trying to do a wait and see situation. It's frustrating, certainly in the UK. But as Stefan said, at the moment, relations are very good with the company on other matters, the COVID crisis and what have you. And I expect that we'll be able to, we need to think positively. We need to think that they're either going to change the agreement to allow the UK to stay in. But it's very frustrating. They will take it right down to the wire, and I think that's perhaps the French way of doing things.
to add that the positive thing is currently we have postponed our elections. Normally at May we should have elections for the new ECWC. We all agreed that because of COVID-19 most of our EU countries are not able to make assemblies in order to send new people. So we have a clause in our agreement to say, okay, we can lengthen up the mandate for at least up to 6 months. And now we're talking about make elections maybe in September or October. The company has also written down that currently they fully accept UK as members. So they have allocated in the new setup 2 seats to UK based on the numbers of people representing UK workforce. So currently they are not talking us out of it. What the future will bring, I don't know. Maybe some other actions make them consider it would be very better to have the UK in the ECWC. But that is another story.
Okay, thank you. It's 11 o'clock, so I suggest that we close the Brexit debate here.